There is division within Lucasfilm, a house which is divided between two factions. One faction consists of those who love the original Star Wars as created under the watchful eye of George Lucas and who want to see that vision continue. The other faction, let's call it the Kathleen Kennedy faction, consists of activists that think of Star Wars as little more than a convenient tool to socially engineer what in their minds would be a better world. The finest hour of the Kathleen Kennedy faction was the release of The Last Jedi, but it has since become the focal point of the conflict within Lucasfilm and to some extent within Hollywood at large. In this video, we will explore the significance The Last Jedi holds to Hollywood in general, and the Kennedy faction in particular, and how they are in upheaval about the push from the George Lucas faction to erase it, as well as the rest of the sequel trilogy with it from official Star Wars continuity. Finally, whether or not the Disney trilogy is wiped from canon, we will explore what the future might hold for the Star Wars brand. Kathleen Kennedy has many admirers within Hollywood due to her association with Steven Spielberg, and therefore the success of his movies. But even her admirers will tell you that she was never a fan of Star Wars and probably never understood the appeal of it. However, what she did understand was what a great vehicle it could be to further the ideological cause she, and many others within Hollywood, the media, and academia champion. As such, the biggest mistake George Lucas made might not have been selling Lucasfilm to Disney, but installing an activist who cared little for his creation before he did. Bob Iger micromanaged The Force Awakens, so apart from planting seeds, Kennedy couldn't go all in on it. However, due to the success of The Force Awakens, Kennedy got free rein on The Last Jedi. Together with director and fellow activist Rian Johnson, she ensured that every plot point and every character was agenda-driven.
Let the past die. Kill it if you have to.
The result was a movie that was praised by a unified press choir as the best thing since sliced bread, and a great achievement in cinema. Within Hollywood, the movie became more than just a movie. It became a symbol of the causes it championed, a graven image. It became an ideological purity test of sorts. If you were a good person, if you wanted a favor within a certain crowd in Hollywood and further your career, you had to worship at the altar of The Last Jedi, whether you privately liked the movie or not.
Am I a little butthurt? No, I'm a lot butthurt.
Yeah.
I think that we, Jedi Council, has been one of the leading Star Wars voices for the last 5 years. I've been busting my fucking ass being a Star Wars fan for 5 fucking years
I feel
on
the
the show.
same way.
Failure to do so could have adverse career repercussions. There was a huge problem though. For all the praise both the industry and the entertainment media complex heaped upon the movie, the actual movie-going public did not agree. Many will argue that the rot set in already with The Force Awakens, which indeed is where the seeds that would come to fruition in The Last Jedi were planted. To be fair, The Force Awakens also planted other story seeds that Abrams had intended to blossom over the course of the trilogy, but Rian Johnson weeded all of these out. Be that as it may, the box office receipts say that the movie was a massive hit and generally liked by the movie-going audience. We can say this not just because of the $247 million opening weekend, which was the biggest opening weekend on record at the time, but because of how much it grossed by the end of its run. By contrast, The Last Jedi opened to slightly less than $30 million below The Force Awakens, which is to be expected given the massive hype surrounding the first Star Wars movie in a decade. For The Last Jedi to open to $220 million was a very healthy opening. By the end of its run, however, The Last Jedi had fallen more than $700 million below the final tally of The Force Awakens. The drop from more than $2 billion to crossing barely $1.3 billion can only be attributed to poor audience word of mouth, especially in light of the overly positive reviews from professional critics. More than any other movie, The Last Jedi showcased the widening gap between the audience and the entertainment media complex. It was in the aftermath of The Last Jedi that the arrows started turning downwards for Disney. This was when merchandise sales, up until then slightly behind projections, nosedived. This was when the ensuing Solo a Star Wars Story movie did what no other Star Wars movie had done before and outright flopped. This was when Galaxy's Edge opened and similarly tanked. This was when the fandom menace formed. This was when Bob Iger personally stepped in and it became clear Kathleen Kennedy had lost his favor. Disney wouldn't even announce her tenure as head honcho of Lucasfilm had been extended until 2021, allegedly because they couldn't find anyone else willing to take over with the third movie of the trilogy still on the horizon. In the end, Iger himself started micromanaging the third movie of the trilogy, to the point where it became about walking back and undoing The Last Jedi. By the end of its run, it barely crossed $1 billion worldwide and was even outgrossed by The Joker. Such was the damage afflicted by The Last Jedi upon the Star Wars brand. While The Last Jedi retained its stature and position as an ideological purity test within the industry, not everyone loves it. In an interview with Geeks Gamers, screenwriter, director, and novelist Kamran Pasha revealed that he had been told by sources close to George Lucas that Lucas himself hates The Last Jedi, which frankly shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone. However, he was prevented from expressing his dislike publicly. Speaking out about his disapproval of even The Force Awakens had not won him any favors with Disney. Pasha could furthermore reveal that he had heard from sources close to Jon Favreau that Favreau is also not a fan of The Last Jedi, and that one of the reasons he approached Disney about doing The Mandalorian was that in his view, Disney was off track. According to our sources, it was Iger who then facilitated Favreau into doing The Mandalorian, which had only the barest minimum of involvement from Kathleen Kennedy, while Iger brought in more talent associated with Marvel for future movies for Lucasfilm. The Mandalorian turned out to be a hit for Disney+, and it won the favor of many a fan who the sequel trilogy had all but chased away. In many ways, it signaled a new hope for Star Wars. Kathleen Kennedy would not take that lying down. With Kathleen Kennedy's contract due to expire sometime in 2021, it would appear her priority right now is cementing her legacy by ensuring Star Wars remains activist. To this end, she brought on Leslie Headland without getting the necessary approval from Disney. She was also instrumental in the delays the Obi-Wan series had been subjected to, as well as attempting to infuse her agenda into The Mandalorian. Her big fight right now, though, is for preserving the placement of not just The Last Jedi, but her entire sequel trilogy within canon. Over the course of a series of videos, our good friend and the future ruler of Earth, Dictor Van Doomcock, has learned from his sources that of the many battlefronts within Lucasfilm, one is over the placement of the entire sequel trilogy within the canon of Star Wars. According to Doomcock's sources, a faction within Lucasfilm, the faction that is loyal to George Lucas, and you can count Jon Favreau as part of it, is working towards erasing the entirety of the sequel trilogy from Star Wars canon, presumably because by the time all was said and done, it blew up in their faces. If the George Lucas faction were to get their way, the sequel trilogy would be consigned to a separate alternate timeline, much like the Kelvin timeline seen in Bad Robot's Star Trek movies. In other words, the sequel trilogy would fall under the Legends banner, right next to all the books and comics Kathleen Kennedy claims do not exist. How could such a thing happen? There are two sides of it, the first one of which is practical. All that really has to be done is for Lucasfilm to decide this never happened, and simply remove them from their internal Bible of Star Wars canon which guides writers and filmmakers in what they can and cannot do going forward with the storytelling of the Star Wars universe. That way, inconsistencies with the stories as told in the sequel trilogy will be gradually introduced, and eventually they will be overwritten altogether. All that is really needed is for Lucasfilm to decide it is to be so, and then the sequel trilogy will, for creative purposes, be wiped from existence. However, merely wiping the sequel trilogy from the internal Lucasfilm documents of what is and is not canon will not wipe the movie-going audience's memories of actually having paid to see the sequel trilogy on the big screen. It will not wipe them from Disney+, and it will not wipe the Blu-rays from the physical collections of anyone who has them. At the very least, to reduce audience confusion and to keep fans from doing much of the legwork in disseminating the new status quo, a creative reason is needed. According to Doomcock's sources, the creative reason within canon that will be used to remove the sequel trilogy in its entirety from canon is the Veil of the Force. In episode 13 in season 4 of Star Wars Rebels, in an episode titled A World Between Worlds, they introduced the idea of the Veil of the Force. The Veil of the Force is a mystical dimension of the Force that connects all of time and space. The concept is similar to the Guardian of Forever from the canon of Star Trek, or to go back even further in time to the Mirrors of Tuzun Thun from the stories of Conan the Barbarian creator Robert E. Howard. According to Doomcock's sources, Emperor Palpatine had a room of mirrors on the second Death Star linked to the Veil of the Force, which used all sorts of nefarious Force shenanigans, and as Darth Vader threw him down the shaft in Return of the Jedi, he transported himself to the Veil, thereby creating the timeline of the sequel trilogy. All that has to be done is to prevent him from leaving it, and the sequel trilogy will be effectively undone, resetting the clock from the end of Episode 6. Thus, the solution is, in effect, to make a multiverse, just like the MCU and the DC Extended Universe are about to be established as, but only as a means to have somewhere to creatively place the sequel trilogy once the installments of it presumably lose their episodes designation. While we are not able to either confirm or deny that the Veil of the Force is the means that will be used, our own sources have told us that there is indeed a desire to render the entire sequel trilogy null and void, coming from very high places. However, as our sources emphasized, this is not about pleasing the fans, but the shareholders. Apparently, Kathleen Kennedy's brand of activism has been very expensive, not just in terms of the theatrical gross being cut in half from the first to the last movie of her sequel trilogy, but in terms of unfilled merchandise sales and lack of interest from third-party licensees. As usual, you must take this with a grain of salt and treat it as rumor, but according to our sources with ties to Disney and Lucasfilm, the powers that be do not believe there is a way forward from the sequel trilogy. The feeling is that they will have to rebuild without the activism, using the original movies as the foundation and take a cue from The Mandalorian, as that has gone down well. Making Star Wars profitable in the future is something of a priority right now, as the lockdown has not exactly done Disney shareholders any favors, let's say. Needless to say, Kathleen Kennedy is doing everything in her power to crush this idea, as it would undermine everything she did in order to, in her mind, change the world for the better during her tenure at Lucasfilm. And if there is one thing Kathleen Kennedy is good at, it is being a politician. What they ultimately will decide has not yet been decided, and there is very little we on the outside can do about it. We shall keep you up to date as we learn where the chips fall down. In the meantime, there is one thing we all can do. The problem with the silent majority is that they are silent, and those that aren't silent are frequently ridiculed. Case in point, those campaigning for the release of the Snyder Cut. For years, Warner considered them an annoyance. The Snyder Cut was a testament to their own mismanagement of not just Justice League, but DC on film as a whole. As such, they wanted to bury it, and they had no qualms about insulting the vocal fans who wanted it released. They even put a visual insult on screen in the animated Harley Quinn series. There, they had two modern-day versions of Beavis and Butthead stand in for the fans, one wearing a Release the Snyder Cut t-shirt, the other wearing a The Last Jedi is Not Canon t-shirt. As we said earlier, The Last Jedi is a golden calf and an ideological purity test within the industry. Anyone who disses the fans critical of it gets brownie points. While this dig at the fans no doubt won Warner Animation favor with Kathleen Kennedy's camp at Lucasfilm, it would come back to bite them in the ass. Because Warner's corporate overlord AT&T would later undermine them by mandating they actually release the Snyder Cut. See our separate video for the corporate shenanigans behind that. Not only that, corporate overlords AT&T would undermine Warner's choice for Batman in Robert Pattinson by pushing for Michael Keaton to return as Batman on the big screen, while Affleck returning as Batman on HBO Max is an option on the table. And while more went into it, it all began by fans voicing their support for the Snyder Cut. Likewise, if you want the Disney Star Wars sequel trilogy, and The Last Jedi with it, to be stricken from canon, then voice that opinion. Show the higher-ups at Disney that fan and shareholder interests align. To help you in doing so, we actually made the shirt they created to mock you, and you can bet they regret that right now. You can get your The Last Jedi is Not Canon shirt in the link in the description. Wear it with pride. Let us know your thoughts on all this in the comments.